Well, welcome, colleagues. My name is Peter Lowen. I'm the director of the Monk School. Wonderful to see all of you here for this conversation with Peter Mansbridge and Ambassador Ahlin from Sweden. Before we start, I want to just acknowledge that we are operating on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we're fortunate and thankful and lucky to be here, working and living and playing and thriving here on this part of Turtle Island. It's a real pleasure to have Ambassador Ahlin with us today. He's the ambassador of Sweden to Canada. He has been since February 2019. And prior to his appointment, he was a member of the Swedish Parliament, a member of the Social Democratic Party, and very importantly, the Speaker of Parliament. When he was a member of Parliament before he was Speaker, he was, I might say, an advocate for greater Swedish engagement in Europe, greater Swedish responsibility in the defense of Europe. It's highly relevant today, given the posture of Russia and the place of Sweden and where it is in Europe. So we're going to have a wonderful conversation today with Ambassador Ahlin about the role of Sweden in Europe and where Europe is right now. So we couldn't have someone better here, and we're very, very lucky to have him here with us. Facilitating this conversation is someone who doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give one anyways. Peter Mansbridge is known to all of you. He's Canada's most celebrated broadcaster. He's a longtime host of CBC's The National, and he's the current host of a current affairs podcast, which I recommend to you, The Bridge. He also happens to be a distinguished fellow here at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And for all of you who are online and for those who are here in person, we're very, very thankful to have Peter Mansbridge with us. So I'll ask Ambassador Ahlin to come up and say a few words, and then you'll have a conversation with Mr. Mansbridge. And just before that, I'll ask you to join me in welcoming them to the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure for me to be back here. A couple of months ago, I was here with my Nordic colleagues, and we had a wonderful discussion about what's going on in Russia and so on, because that was only a couple of weeks after the invasion started in Ukraine. So thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview on Swedish foreign policy in certain areas. First, of course, with Finland and Sweden now applying to be members of NATO, I think it's important to give you a little bit of an understanding and overview how Sweden and Finland actually came to that conclusion, because it's not only that Russia suddenly invaded Ukraine. There is a little bit of a longer story here. And I'm actually going to start in the beginning of the 1800s, when we were fighting the Russians, and we lost, and we had to give up Finland. So during that time, before that, Sweden was a regional kind of empire in the northern part of Europe, with Norway and Finland and parts of Germany and so on. But we lost against the Russians. We had to give up Finland. And if you talk to Swedish people back home and they talk about Finland, they still say the eastern half of the country. Okay, more or less, 200 years after, we are still considering it a little bit of a half part of our country. People in Sweden were then really sick and tired of being at war all the time. So the king was ousted, lots of turmoil internally in Sweden, and neutrality was decided. In the future, we don't want to go to war. We're going to be neutral when there are wars in Europe. And because people were sick and tired of paying for it, right? So we lost Finland. Finland became not say part of Russia, but really influenced by Russia at that time. It's a kind of an furstedöme, I don't know what you call that in English, but a kind of a part of the Russian Tsarist Federation. So we started the neutrality from there. First World War, but lots of wars between there that we were not engaged in at all. First World War, we managed to stay outside. The Second World War, we managed to stay outside. Some people think we were kind of chicken and, not really daring to take side. There was some truth in it. But being a government during a world war, you really want to keep your country outside of the war. So when the war ended and NATO was started, the Swedish population were actually pretty happy. Wow, we are one of the very few countries in Europe that has been outside 2 world wars. So the appetite for joining NATO was very little, because neutrality has been so good for so many years, right? And there was another factor as well. In the Second World War, the Finns were fighting the Russians, not only once, but the Soviets, not only once, but 2 times. And, Soviet Union was a strong power. Finland fought it hard, but they had in the end to kind of make an agreement between Finland and Sweden. And it was a kind of a solidarity and friendship agreement. So Sweden was sitting there, successfully out of the war, having a long traditional neutrality, seeing our eastern half of our country being under the Russian Bear's wings in this solidarity agreement. So it was actually a very easy decision for the Swedish politician at that time to say, if we join NATO, we leave the neutrality, but we also will leave Finland in a very bad spot close to the Russians. So already at that time, a big chunk of the neutrality was actually defined by our neighbor Finland and their relationship with Soviet Union. Fast forward. During the Cold War, Sweden invested a lot in defense. We had sometimes even 5% of our GDP was spending on military defense. We had an enormous defense industry because we wanted to be trustworthy neutrals. And you cannot be neutrals if you don't have arms, if you don't have soldiers, because then everyone will look at you and say, you say you're neutral, but when the things hit the fan, you don't have anything to defend yourself with. But we paid a lot of money. And unfortunately, Canada was not smart enough to buy our fighter jets. They bought something else. The problem, maybe you will buy our wonderful submarines later on. But having said that, Sweden is a small country with 10 million people. And we are really one of the few countries that even can make a fighter jet. We have wonderful submarines and a lot of other defense equipment. And that is only because we spent lots of money during the Cold War to be trustworthy neutrals. During the time, we really wanted to do good as well. So we had well-trained soldiers, we had well-equipped soldiers. So we went to the UN, of course, and said, hey, we would love to take part in peacekeeping operations. So more than 1% of the Swedish population have actually taken part in peacekeeping operations in the world. That's pretty good, I must say. 1% of the population has been out in the peacekeeping operations. So we really not just paid, we wanted to use our money, our soldiers, our equipment as well for something good. Soviet Union breakdown. Gorbachev come in, and I would like to correct here now because I have met Gorbachev several times. He was not the one inventing glasnost and perestroika. In my view, he had no idea what he was doing. It was his friend Yakovlev, who was a smart guy, who really wanted to do the glasnost and perestroika and really restructure Soviet Union and get it into a more social democratic society. Yakovlev's ideas were so hated by the Politburo in Russia or in Soviet Union at that time, so they sent him to be the ambassador in Canada. Just saying. And then when Gorbachev became the Secretary General, he actually brought Yakovlev back. And so I'm not that super impressed by Gorbachev, to say that. And I'm a little bit angry with him still because I was at Yakovlev's funeral in Moscow with all the Democrats and the liberals. Gorbachev was not there. He was in Germany delivering speeches and gaining a lot of money from these speeches. Okay, that was my kind of, bad feeling from this, but that's how it is. Soviet Union broke down. So the Swedish parliament was sitting discussing, okay, we are neutrals, but neutrals between what? Warsaw Pact is no longer there, right? So we knew that the Swedish population are still very much in favor of neutrality because it has kept us out of war. They really don't want us to join NATO, but we changed it to military non-alignment. And we said, okay, we really want to do good in the world. Peacekeeping operation at that time totally changed, as you know, from being peacekeeping to peace enforcing. Remember Bosnia, Kosovo, and so on. The UN couldn't really do the work because it was about peace implementing, stopping people from killing each other. It was not just standing in between two parties that have agreed on a kind of a peace, right? What happened? Yeah, UN asked NATO to, you really need to come in with your equipment and your soldiers and your planning and be part of this. And then Sweden, of course, said, yeah, we also want to do good things. So immediately we came closer and closer to NATO in everything like planning, doing these operations and implementation forces and so on. So we were one of the first members of the Partnership for Peace with NATO. And from that moment, I was in the Foreign Affairs Committee back home in the Swedish Parliament, and everything we did was to be as close to NATO as possible, but not Article 5, being members. Everything else was there. And so when the Russians first invaded Georgia in 2008, a big debate started in Sweden about what is going on here. And until then, not myself, I would like to say, but in the 90s, I was traveling back and forth to Russia a lot, trying to help them, you know, saying, okay, if you want to learn from our labor market system, our pension system, our taxation system, you're most welcome. So I brought lots of these guys you see on TV nowadays around Putin to Sweden to take part in lots of activities. It didn't help because the Russians suffered from something, and the acronym is not good, but they suffered from post-imperialistic stress syndrome. Okay, and in the end of the 90s, it was so obvious because even when you spoke to, I mean, real kind of liberal Democrats, they said, you know, yeah, Urban, but you know, we are missing one thing. We want our rightful place back in the world. And I asked them, what is your rightful place in the world? Is that to be, you know, the big communistic dictatorship that everyone is afraid of? Is it your nuclear weapons that is the rightful place in the world? Why cannot, you know, your wonderful literature, your wonderful language, or your wonderful ballet, why can't that be your rightful place in the world? And I actually told them, you know, yeah, we lost in Poltava against the Russians, and we realized that we cannot be an empire any longer. So we decided to go home to Sweden and try to fix our own country. Maybe that's a good idea for Russia as well. Don't think about the imperialistic past. Think about what you can do with Russia. I realized pretty quick, actually, and I sent reports back home. And the other day, I actually read a report from one of my meetings with Gorbachev, where we had a big fight about this. When he said, you know, Putin is right, the vertical structure has to be back, the governors are not democratic, they are, you know, yeah, a long discussion. So it started in Georgia. West was totally blinded. You know, we didn't do anything. 2014, Crimea. And everyone was like, what the heck is going on here? But we didn't really take the measures. And when they now invaded Ukraine again, remember that, again, I'm really happy and see that the whole world came together and being so united in its response to Russia. That is really a decisive moment for us. And of course, in Sweden, then the debate started. Okay, if Putin says in speeches in December last year that Sweden and Finland should not decide their own road ahead themselves, they are not allowed to be members of NATO. And if you have kids, you know, if you tell them you're not allowed to do this, the kids really want to do it, right? And it's the same here. For Sweden and Finland, we came to a situation where, okay, if we say no and say, okay, Putin, we promise we will not be members of NATO. What does that mean for a country? Have we given up our own right to decide ourselves what kind of security policy we want to have? How can we be sure that we are not under the Russian, you know, boots for the long time forward? So actually, in my view, Putin didn't give us much of a choice when he said that. Russia and Sweden and Finland really had to show that, you know, we take care of our own things, you take care of yours. And the debate started. And as I said, I think we would have joined NATO even though in the future, but not with that speed as it happened, and with a broad majority from the political spectrum. In Sweden, it's more or less only the left party that is against. The Green Party said we are against, but when we now have taken the decision, we accept it and we will never argue about it. And the election in September, there was not an issue at all in the Swedish election campaign. So it's fascinating to see how something that was so there and so sacred in the Swedish foreign policy for so many decades in a very short period of time could be totally different and a non-issue in the future. But I want to give you, you know, all the opportunities to ask me questions and so on. But there is, as I said last time I was here, we really need to think through what we're going to do with Russia after this war. I'm certain that the only way forward is that the Russia loses the war in Ukraine, but we need to think, you know, how do we deal with the Russia after the war? We didn't do it correctly in the 90s. I was naive. I thought that with a market economy, people will make more money. They will demand liberal, liberal reforms. They will demand a kind of a democratic structure. That was wrong. It was wrong. And I think we have learned that, even if a country is becoming richer, people will have more money. It doesn't turn automatically to a democracy just because of that. So we need to think that through really hard. And I'm pretty sure, Peter, and you will also have lots of questions about the Swedish election back home, and I'm absolutely eager to answer them as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now you know why he was the Speaker of the Swedish Parliament, as well as one of the country's leading diplomats now. And I think it's important to recognize that the Speaker has a certain elevation in Sweden that we don't see here. I mean, what's the pecking order? It goes King, Speaker, Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's how it is. Yes.
Must have a great residence.
And the reason behind that is that we took away all the political power from the king in the 70s. And, in all monarchies, it's always the king or the queen who after an election proposes a new prime minister. And politicians at that time back home, or elected officials, as you say here in North America, elected officials at that time didn't want the king to have that power. So they said, we take that away. And the question was, who should then have it? And then everyone was pointing at the speaker. And so the speaker is super neutral in Sweden. So you have to take your party pins off, give up all your party affiliations, and really work for the 8 political parties that we have in Poland.
We don't see that often anywhere. So good for you if that actually works. Look, I want to talk about, as you suspected, the post-election Sweden and what it'll mean, not only for your country, but for the rest of the world. But I've got to start with, you spent so much time talking about Russia that I've got to talk about today's news just for a minute. Putin last night in his speech, said he's going to increase the troops up by 300,000, which most analysts have said he had to do because he was losing. But he also once again threatened the nuclear option. Now, the debate today is he bluffing? Is it real? For us from a distance, we look at it a certain way. You're not at a distance. Your country's not at a distance. So
pretty close. Yeah.
Pretty close. So do you see it as, he is the master bluffer, always has been. Is he bluffing or is this serious?
It's really hard to say. I have no idea if he's bluffing or if he will be kind of a wounded bear in a corner, and being really dangerous and do stupid things. I can't exclude that. Absolutely not. But the problem is that even though it doesn't give us any choices, because if someone is threatening you saying, we're going to use the nuclear bomb, should we just give up and say, okay, we lay down and you decide everything in the world from now on? That's not an option. So you really need to stand up against bullies like that, and we need to check out, are you bluffing or not, more or less? It sounds dangerous, but do you really want to live in a world where a leader with nuclear weapons in the future can threaten you every second week and say, if I don't get it my way, I'm going to bomb you? I mean, that's not the way forward. Personally, and this is my personal view, I don't really think, and I would say I don't think the Swedish government also think that there is an instant threat of a nuclear war. I don't think so. Everyone is, of course, concerned if Putin is so isolated, cornered, so he might take some stupid decisions. But still, in my personal view, I really don't think it's gonna happen, actually, Of course, big strategic bombers and things like that, I think we can rule out. Maybe a tactical bomb somewhere in Kiev or, somewhere in Ukraine, not in Kiev, that would be disastrous, but somewhere in Kiev, just to show them that we are serious and I'll give up. But I think that's a red line that Putin doesn't want to cross.
I think your point about you got to stand up to a bully, you have to say something. And so as we're sitting here talking, Biden is about to speak to the UN General Assembly.
Yes.
They were apparently rewriting his speech last night. One assumes he's going to say something. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to find out what it was. All right,
Don't do it. I think that's what he's going to say.
Don't do it. Let me get to the issue of Sweden in the post-election. I realize that hasn't been resolved yet.
May I say one more thing about what Putin said yesterday?
Sure.
Because I think he's actually going into a very delicate situation now. And if you look upon the soldiers that has been sent to the war in Ukraine, they really come from the poor areas of Russia. So lots of people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, more of the, the fancy places in Russia, they haven't really felt it, They hear about people being killed and so on, but it's not really close to them. And I know I'm saying bad things now, but the southern neighbor and so on. But there is in big countries sometimes when you have soldiers that are paid to do the war, people at home, okay, they took their own decision to go to the war. So if they die, that's their problem, and the state is actually paying, the family money, right? So, but now when you're talking about we need to bring in more soldiers, it's kind of a partly mobilization. It's going to hit a lot of people. And, there are people sitting in Moscow and saying, yeah, I really think Putin is right. Historically, Ukraine, Lugansk, Donetsk and all this, that belong to Russia. But my son going there? Oh, hell no. So I think, this is really a sensitive, and it's terrible step for Putin. I think he knows that it can be a negative reaction now from people in Russia. Russians are not bloodthirsty, they're decent people, educated, smart people. So I think this can be actually a very dangerous move by Putin for himself, where lots of people in the kind of the nomenclatura will start questioning, should my son go there? It's okay if it's poor Oleg from somewhere, doing it.
I mean, so the analysts suggest that right now is somewhere between 100 and 200,000 Russian troops there. He's talking about increasing it more than double that.
Yes.
They got to come from somewhere. And I hear you on that point, that it's going to start affecting people who've kind of checked out of the discussion and the debate.
Exactly.
Sweden. I think the way most Canadians have historically looked at Sweden, aside from the fact it has some pretty good hockey players.
Pretty good.
I saw you, with your selfie with Alfredson in Ottawa doing an event the other day, which is good for you. We didn't like him much here in Toronto, but
we had Mats Sundin here at National Day in Toronto as well.
Right,
that's pretty good.
But I think most ways Canadians have looked at Sweden over the years, who haven't delved deeply into the political story in Sweden, but they mostly look at it as a country of equality, social caring. And they're wondering now, with the little they've heard about the election, whether that's going to continue with the move, to a right of center coalition. A lot of talk about immigration during the campaign. Do those kind of twin pillars of the way we've looked at Sweden, how do those change?
When it comes to be a social welfare state, as we are, with universal health care, and you don't need to pay anything for universities, and having a pretty the equity, the equality in the society. No, that's not going to change at all. I mean, even if it's a center-right government, it's not only a kind of a social democratic idea. It's very much ingrained into the Swedish society. And I would say this election was partly, was very much about refugees, because we need to talk about immigration and refugees, migrants, refugees here, because it's always a mixed feelings when you talk to Canadians, because there's so different system here. But having said that, that what Swedish voters obviously has been nervous about is what kind of effect will it have on our pension system, on our schools, on our kind of universal health care and so on, with this amount of refugees that we have back home in Sweden, that we haven't been good enough in integrating and getting them to job. So it's more like it's a reaction to save what you are talking about. So I don't see, the fight in the political landscape in Sweden there was a long time ago where it was like the right said, oh, we have too fluffy, big welfare systems in Sweden. We need to cut that and we need to do. That is long gone. You don't win elections in Sweden by saying that. And I'm the ambassador of Sweden now, but if I can dress myself in my former position as a social democratic politician, I can say that when we social democrats lost the election to a conservative government, before that with Reinfeldt was the prime minister, in the election campaign, he said, we promised the people that we will deliver the same service, the same welfare as the social democrats, but we will cut taxes. And I think that was the only way to win elections, because it's so different. In Sweden, you can win elections by saying we need to increase the taxes to spend more money on healthcare or childcare. And that's okay. People vote for you. So it's a little, in North American context, that's pretty strange, but that's how it is. So I don't think that is the issue. The thing that has been decisive in this election campaign has been the number of refugees that Sweden has received the last few years. And
how's that going to change? What will change?
When I talk to Canadian elected officials, they speak about migration, and you have your support system and you have your point systems. You are looking for, the brains out there, and they will migrate to Canada. In Sweden, the policy has been that we want to help people that are in need, that are fleeing from a war, or they are in UN refugee camps, or something like that. So it has been a strong support among the Swedish people that we, as a rich country, we should actually be, show solidarity and help people that are in need. So I think that's actually still there. But when the Syria crisis happened, in a couple of months in the autumn of 2015, we received more than 160,000. And that's pretty many for a population of 10 million. And they came in so big numbers. So it was a kind of lots of voters, at least at that time, felt like, oh, this is out of control. We can't really, control it. What is going on here? And I think in the Swedish psyche, it's more like we need to know that it is under control. We trust the state. We do that. We really trust the state. We trust elected officials back home in Sweden. And if we see that the system is not working, then there is a big push, that this cannot continue. We look upon the Germans like that, and think that the Germans is always in Ordnung, and the Germans look upon Sweden as, the country that has everything in order. And I think that was the main factor here. And so lots of people came. I don't know how many Canada took at that time, but not even as many. Yeah. And 160,000, and many of them illiterate, not educated. And Sweden is a very high-tech country. It's really hard to get them into work and be integrated in the society. So I can say when you had your Governor General, Johnston, in Sweden on a state visit, he was sitting in my big meeting room that I had as a speaker, and I had the leaders, the fraction leaders from the 8 political parties with me, and we spoke about migration and so on. And he said, oh yes, Sweden and Canada, we are so similar, and we are doing so much on migration. And then everyone started to tell, how it works in Sweden, right? And we are talking about refugees, and you're talking about work migrants. And he was like, what? Suddenly he realized that that's two totally different things. And it's right. We have a much more delicate situation to integrate people than you have in Canada because of your system.
Okay, let me, I've only got a few more minutes as it turns out before we open the floor, but let me try to hit a couple of points. Just as a last point on immigration, when you say taking control, does taking control mean closing the borders?
No, more, I mean, some political parties ask for that and say that we should kick immigrants out.
That's not going to happen?
I don't know. It's up to the center-right government that is now trying to form itself. they might come with ideas there.
Would you be surprised if it happened?
Oh, I would be surprised. I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay.
But we will let fewer refugees in. All political parties, more or less, maybe not from the left side is saying that, but more or less everyone else is saying that we need kind of a pause now where we start integrating and get things in order before we can open up our borders again.
All right. There are 8 parties in Sweden. This will be a coalition government of some kind of center-right.
Yes. We think.
Coalition governments can end in chaos. We've all seen that. We haven't quite seen it here, but there's potential for it here. Are you worried that the potential is higher now in Sweden, that this is not going to work?
No, I can't say that. As a former speaker, I have a big trust in the Swedish parliamentary system. And even though we have had a very tough debate in the election campaign, but elected officials back home in Sweden, they can still talk to each other. They can sit in the same room and make agreements. So when we do things like NATO membership, or we decide how to increase our expenditure on defense, or if we're going to do some big changes in our pension system, the tradition is in Sweden that, okay, we bring all the political parties together into a room and we negotiate and we come up with a solution that hold for a long period of time, no matter what kind of government we have. So we have a little bit of a different political tradition than many other countries.
Yeah, including this one. So maybe you can give some advice.
Yeah,
I'm
surprised how polarized it is in Canada, because that's not the view you have when you're in Sweden, right?
Right.
But it has been a pretty problematic trip in the situation for the Social Democratic government until now as well. The government has resigned. The prime minister had to resign the same day she was elected first, because the Green Party left the government. The speaker after me, he had 134 days to form a new government after the election in 2018. I mean, that's never heard of. I mean, Sweden has always been the beacon of stability in Europe. They have an election, the election result, they have a new government, period. And now we have started looking like, in a joke, like Italy or something, government comes and go like this, which
that can happen with coalitions.
Yeah.
But are you suggesting that it's a degree of instability there right now?
Oh yeah, it has been a degree of instability for a long period of time. I wouldn't blame the center-right situation now. We have had an instability for a pretty long time. And that is because we have this new party, the Sweden Democrats, that are considered to be a right-wing party, anti-immigration. Because until, before they came, the Social Democrats had some parties on the left, and you had the center-right parties on the right, and you had 2 blocks. And if you compare to Germany, for instance, in Germany, the right bloc has almost won all elections with 53 to 47. In Sweden, it has been the opposite. It has been the left side that has been winning election with 53 to 47. But since these Sweden Democrats came into the arena, taking voters from both left and right, becoming, kind of a third factor, if you would like to say so, it's really hard to find a majority. So now the center-right is saying, okay, we want to use the Sweden Democrats' mandates in parliament together with the other 3 center-right political parties and form a government. The Sweden Democrats, we don't know if they're going to join the government or if they're going to be outside the government, but that's what they are trying to fix. And that is, they have 176 seats, and the left side have 173. We will see. We'll see in a couple of days what's going to happen.
You mentioned just a few moments ago the NATO membership, the application for it. Not through yet, but it's heading in that direction. And you mentioned it in your opening remarks. As somebody who was Speaker of the Swedish Parliament, who had spent a lot of time as a member of the Parliament concerned about foreign issues, foreign policy, could you have imagined 5 years ago that Sweden would apply for NATO?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But there is, personally, it's another history. I was the Social Democrat who dealt with the NATO issues all the time.
Right.
And I have always been not having that kind of reflexes against NATO. I thought it was more like, okay, NATO is here. That's where our friends are, our values and so on. We have our kind of history tradition in Sweden that for now prevents us
to join NATO. It was not, you didn't want to take a fight with the voters on an issue that is not really a big deal.
Was Russia the tipping point?
Yeah, I mean, that changed the whole kind of mathematics, right?
For everyone? Was it became
more or less for
universal?
everyone. Yeah, I mean, when it happens, and we had a discussion about, are we going to send weapons to Ukraine?
Mhm.
And Sweden has always been very cautious about sending weapons abroad during a conflict. The last time we did that was when the Finns were fighting the Soviet Union in the Second World War. That's pretty long time back. And all political parties, even the left party, the former Communist Party, said that, yes, it's right to send anti-tank weapons. And these are pretty good anti-tank weapons. It's not the old Swedish ones that you sell. You had called Gustav. We have sold anti-tank weapons to you called Gustav. And the old version that you sent to Ukraine, we sent the new ones that are pretty good. So we sent 5,000 and every political party agreed on it. And if you would have asked me that a month before, I would say that will never happen. So that was a big change.
You mentioned in your remarks, you mentioned we should be buying Swedish submarines. We only buy used, collapsed submarines from other countries. So as much as as a former member of the Canadian Navy, I tend to agree with you that we should be buying something a little more sophisticated. Last point on NATO. Was it an issue at all in the election campaign?
Nothing at all. No. Nothing.
Never came up.
No, never came up. And to finish that, I had a conversation with the Prime Minister back home, because she's a friend of mine, right? And she was curious because I dealt with NATO issues internally in the party. So she wanted to hear my view before they, took the step. And I actually quoted a Finnish diplomat, and his name is Max Jakobsen, a really old guy. He's dead now, but really one of the biggest diplomats Finland had. He was asked, he said like this about NATO. If you ask the Finnish people if they would like to join NATO, 80% says no. If you ask the Finnish people if they think Finland will join NATO, 80% say yes. And I said, I think it is exactly the same in Sweden. Everyone knows it's there. We're working so close with NATO. We have a host agreement, for countries coming to Sweden and so on. So it's just like when the decision is made, people will say, yeah, that's what we always thought. We are more or less a NATO country already, and the issue is gone. And the funny thing is here that actually some members of my former party affiliation, they were afraid that we're going to lose voters to the left party. But after the decision was made, actually the opposite happened.
When you took up this appointment as ambassador to Canada, you gave an interview where you said Sweden and Canada should get together. And this was like 2019, 2018, somewhere back then. Before this became a popular refrain, you were saying Sweden and Canada should get together to push an agenda of protecting democracy.
Yeah. I think I actually said pushing for democracy, not only protecting, not only defending any longer. We need to be offensive. Yes.
Well, and now the concern is, are we protecting democracy, right? So did Canada and Sweden fail in that?
Oh yeah, we have failed all. Because we thought it was a self-paddling system, when economy is growing, globalization is taking, speed, people will be more rich and happy. We thought that was equal, that there will be a popular demand for democracy. That was wrong. Democracy is much more, sensible, organic. It has to, come from within. There has to be lots of tradition. It has to be in the culture. And I'm thinking every day, what are we going to do when Russia loses this war? Because I don't want Russia, to lose the war in a way that they will forever be a big threat to us, right? I want them to lose the war, go home to Moscow and say, okay, we need to refocus on how do we make the life better for the Russian population, and how can we then help them, to have a transparent, open, governing, democratic society. When the tradition
can that happen with Putin still in power?
No, that won't happen.
So he's got to go.
No, he got to go. Absolutely, yeah, and he will, yeah. And so how do we do that? How do we really do that?
Well, it's not just how do we
And it's
do it,
when-
it's
when-
how did they do it?
Exactly.
Right?
No, and the question is, how much can we push it? And the problem here was that George W. Bush had his, democracy agenda where he wanted to push democracy out in the world. And he said, that we have had long-term friends like Saudi Arabia, and we have looked upon it on short-term benefits. But in the long term, it would have been better if we had pushed the democracy agenda. But since it was George W. Bush who said it, no one liked it, right? So it was a lot of hesitance against the kind of a democracy promotion agenda. I actually think we need to do that because we are under threat from countries like China, Russia, and others. They are questioning our democracy. They are questioning our international norms, our standards. Wherever you look, if it's in UN or OSCE or European Council, Council of Europe, whatever, these countries are challenging everything and trying to get away with it, and do other stuff. So we need to be tougher. We need to, to step up. How? I'm not sure at all.
I want to go to I've got a question on the Arctic Council, of which both Sweden and Canada are members. And how do you see that unfolding? But I want to bring in some of the audience here to get a sense of, can I remind you, if you ask a question, the point is to ask the question, right? And the ambassador will respond in kind. So are there any, there have been some questions, I think, coming in online, but in the room, do we have any questions here? This gentleman right here first, and then we'll move, there's quite a few, so we'll move around quickly. So if you can ask your question, we have a mic set up, but if you think your voice is gonna boom out, go for it.
First of all, thank you for coming in and speaking to us. It's very nice of you to take time out every day to do that. My question is around the Swedish defense industry. So you said it was robust, and arguably your regional competitors, the French, they're looking eastward, specifically Asia, to boost defense sales. Is Sweden looking to do the same? And if so, who are the primary target consumers? Are they exclusively democracies or resemblance of a democracy? And if not, what are some of the reservations?
Good question. I mean, first of all, we had a very big defense industry during the Cold War. We spent a lot of money into it. And then during the kind of the peacetime when Soviet Union, was away, we all thought we're going to be fat and happy for the rest of our lives. And in the beginning of the 90s and until around 2004, 2005, we actually cut down a lot on the defense. And we put it into what we called internal defense, like police, healthcare, and other things like that. So we took money from the Swedish defense and we took it to other parts of our public expenditures. And that also affected the defense industry because we felt that, okay, we're living in a new world. We don't need to have the capacity in every single, area. We don't need to make bullets. We don't need to do tanks. We don't need to do this and that and that. So we had to come up with, okay, what is the most important strategic things that we need to do for the future? Where we want to be. And I mean, I don't know all of the kind of the national security things, but I mean, submarines is one. We have the Baltic Sea, it's a little bit of a shallow water. You need a specific kind of submarines to be able, to deter enemies. We want to have our fighter jets. Because we will be able, to do things like that. We are very good when it comes to network. Ericsson company, mobile phones were invented in Sweden and Finland. So the kind of the Internet of Things in defense and how military units are talking to each other and having everything formed, we are super good at that. We are very good in intelligence. Listening to cables and listening to stuff around. We're really good at that. So, we really decided that some areas we shouldn't put any more money in and we focus on this, okay? At the same time, the Swedish parliament has put forward laws, that really regulate the arms exports in Sweden. So it's really strict what they can, export countries to. So actually, arms export are prohibited in Sweden. Full stop. That's the law. Arms export are prohibited. But you can have exceptions from it if it suits our foreign policy, if it's an allied country now. I mean, of course, we're going to send it to NATO allies. The Nordic countries has never been a problem and so on. They need to have, it's not called democracy, but it cannot be a country that is clamping down on human rights and democracy. It cannot be a country that are at war. So Ukraine is a difference here where all the political parties agree that we make an exception. So, and do this exception, we have a board of members from different political parties and a kind of an arm export council that sits and look upon what the defense companies are asking for, and then decide if it is an exception from the law that prohibits arms export. We are very open. Every year they send in a report to Swedish Parliament where everyone can read through exactly what we are doing and what we are selling and so on. And it won't go to countries that are dictatorships in Asia. There is no chance in how that's going to happen.
All right. For the online audience, of which we have one, to hear, you've got to go to the microphone. So you're next. If you want to go to this microphone right here and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm curious about, we expect that a conservative government will take office in Sweden in a couple of weeks, months, soon at least.
A few days, I think.
Yeah. How do you think that's going to affect Swedish foreign policy? And I want to ask specifically about two things. What's going to happen to the feminist foreign policy that Sweden's had since 2014? And how is it going to affect Sweden's image as humanitarian great power? And the budget for like development aid and these kind of things. Thank you.
Of course, I cannot say what the center-right government will do. The person who we think will be the prime minister, we don't know yet, but he's sitting right now negotiating with all the political parties on the center-right about what to do. But if I give you a hint about what has been said in the election campaign and their platforms and so on. When it comes to development aid, some of them, the biggest parties in the center-right coalition, has been pretty clear that they want to cut the development aid. And as many of you know, Sweden is one of the countries that gives most in development aid, more than 1% of our GDP. And I don't know where they're gonna land, but in some proposals, they have said that we should go down to 0.7, that is the UN shame level, so to say, which is, I have to say honestly though, that's a pretty high level compared to many other countries in the world anyway. And I can tell you that when I was a member of parliament, even my government, once upon a time when we had a financial crisis, took down the development aid to 0.7. So it has happened already in a social democratic government earlier. So I think we will see changes when it comes to development aid. Let's put it like this, I would be surprised if they don't do changes on the development aid. When it comes to the feminist foreign policy, I'm not super sure about that. It's a little bit in how to define it, even when they had a center-right government before. Of course, they were pushing for gender equality, helping women and children and so on, having a view that we should look through a kind of a female lens, and follow the money. Where are actually the money going? Are we putting in money and they will leave, or they go to men? That happened before as well. But I think with the feminist foreign policy that the social democratic government, it was more like every decision we take, we're going to put it through this feminist prisma and see, does it really go to the right stuff? Does it strengthen women in the world? Will they have a more say? Will we bring in more women to the table and so on? Maybe there will be changes in kind of slogans. I don't think it will be so much changes actually in the practical things there. It's a pretty broad support among all the political parties back home. But the development aid, yes, I think there will be changes. And how will Sweden be viewed? I think still, as I said, even the social democratic government once lowered it to 0.7. And I was a foreign policy guy then. Not many people in the world said that we were terrible, not the humanitarian superpower, because 0.7 is pretty much money anyhow.
Okay, this lady right here, and we can bounce back and forth here.
Hello to both of you. Thanks so much for coming out. So I'm specifically interested in Arctic security, and I was wondering, I know with Sweden joining NATO, there is the implication that there will be some type of multilateral agreement, but NATO actually doesn't have like an Arctic security plan set out. So I'm wondering if Sweden is trying to use NATO to like sort of create this plan, or if there is still an intent to use the Arctic Council as sort of the dialogue forum. So thank you.
It's a very good question. I think that was what Peter was looking for as well before that. When Sweden and Finland, if Turkey and Hungary, because these are the two countries now that haven't ratified our accession, but when they have and they deposit it to the State Department in Washington and we will be full-fledged members, then all countries in the Arctic Council but Russia will actually be NATO members. We think the Arctic Council is a very important council where we have been able to work with confidence building measures, having discussions with all, with the Russians about the Arctic. Military issues, security things has not been part of the Arctic Council. Personally, I don't think it will be. I can't see any appetite from any other country saying that we should now change the Arctic Council to deal more with military issues. I think everyone wants it to stay as it is, as an area where we can cooperate with each other and find out ways how to deal with environment, climate change and so on in the Arctic and have the Russians on board. So that's what I think gonna happen. It's a totally different other question, of course. When is Russia going to come back? When can we restart the Arctic Council full-fledged again? I think it would take a long time. Personally, I think it will take a very long time because Russia has broken every international law, every agreement. So why should you trust them? It's going to take a long time before we can do that. NATO, they have their high north. It doesn't part of the Canadian Arctic because Canada has always been a little bit like, oh, this is our inland. And we deal with that together with Americans, by the way, but stay out. And actually,
that's because it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I agree. And the funny thing is here that when we talk about Arctic, sometimes lots of people think it is like Antarctica, that there is no countries, there is no territories for different countries. So we can, hear people from Germany sometimes saying, yeah, we should kind of have an international organization taking care of Arctic. And we say, what are we talking about? This is Canada, that is Russia, that is Norway, this is Sweden, that is Finland, that's Iceland. It's already done. But people don't really understand that. They look upon it like it was the South Pole, right? It's really fascinating sometimes. But coming back to the question, I think that if I put it like this, everyone wants to keep Arctic as a very peaceful area where we have very little of military things going on. The problem is we cannot decide that ourselves. If the Chinese are coming with, icebreakers and they do some stuff, they have activities there, or the Russians have materials, harbors, and military kind of capacity, of course, the rest of the world needs to look into it and see, is this a danger for us? What can we do? Personally, I think NATO is the right forum to have that discussion. And I saw that Trudeau invited the Secretary General Stoltenberg to a big trip up in the Canadian Arctic. And I think that's a little bit of a sign that, we need to talk about it at least. We don't want to have an arms race in the Arctic. We don't want to provoke something, but we need to be vigilant as well. But I don't think Arctic Council is not the area for this.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. There are a couple of questions. This gentleman right here, go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. Welcome to Toronto. I'm wondering how you see NATO's track record in West Asia, in Central Asia, or even in North Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, where a Canadian general, Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard, led NATO's invasion of Libya in 2011, and later joined the arms industry in Canada, became president of Lockheed Martin Canada. Do you think NATO's track record, because I think it's been disastrous in the countries that I mentioned, and I hope the NATO that Sweden joins is not that same NATO. Thank you.
Good question.
It's a good question, and lots of Swedish people would ask the same question. But I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding here, though. NATO is an organization that is based on Article 5, that if someone is attacked, the rest of us is going to say, that we come to your defense. If I'm right, I think I am, the Article 5 has only been triggered once, and that was when 11th of September happened. And what happened was that the Americans at that time, they said to NATO, thank you very much for giving us this solidarity with Article 5, but we remember how it is to fight wars in Bosnia and other places, doing it in NATO. So this time, we think we're going to do it ourselves together with UK. So that was happened. So NATO actually said, we trigger Article 5, come to your defense. And the Americans said, thank you very much, but we'd rather do this together with UK. And that was the starting point of the Iraq things and everything like that. What you are mentioning is, it's a big debate back home in Sweden as well. And I am super strong on the side that all of this that you're talking about has a mandate in UN. I have been on the Swedish side, deciding, yeah, you see that you react to it, but I've been into this debate so many times, you can't imagine back home in Sweden. So Sweden, when we were military non-aligned, and we're not yet members of NATO, we wanted to do things in UN peacekeeping operations and so on. And after the Soviet Union broke down, the peacekeeping operation was no longer there. It became more of peace enforcing, going to countries where at war, trying to push the sides aside and so on. A totally different ball game than peacekeeping in Cyprus or other places, right? So what we needed was that the UN didn't have the resources, they didn't have the leadership, they didn't have the kind of operational planning, but NATO had. So, you can, in the UN Charter, you can take a decision that this is legitimate according to international law, and we tell the regional organizations to do the work. European Union has done that. Sweden has taken part in, I think, I'm not really sure, but I would say almost every EU operations abroad, and they are all based on that there is a UN mandate asking, the European Union. ISAF was the same. Where we took part in the NATO operations in Afghanistan was based on a UN mandate. Then you had other things where the Americans decided themselves, I don't even remember the name for it now, that they did in Afghanistan at the same time, which kind of came a little bit too close to each other. I admit that, but it was two separate operations. So my answer to you is that NATO as NATO hasn't really been tried yet. And that is a good sign that NATO, for its existence, has actually deterred war on our continent. Have they been super successful in all operations they have done when they have tried to help out UN? No, not really. Have we been? I mean, when we look upon, as you say, Libya, for instance, or other places, that was not NATO. That was the kind of the world coming together in UN saying that if Gaddafi says that he's gonna eradicate all the cockroaches and rats in Benghazi, it will have the most severe consequences for him. And that is done in a UN Security Council resolution. And that gave the mandate for doing it. So I don't agree with you. I think NATO is Article 5, defending our territory, working together, to fend off enemies. They have been very successful in that. Has every operation they have been taking part in international organization been super good? No, like any other operations in the world.
Got time for one more question. This gentleman right here.
Thank you for the terrific discussion. I'm Ed Schatz from the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at the Monk School. Returning full circle to Putin and the war. You've been a negotiator, successful negotiator in a bunch of different difficult circumstances. And so I'm wondering what you could say about what it would take to begin to think about negotiations. My sense is that Putin can't be a part of that equation, or at least it's impossible to imagine what Putin being a part of this. But even in a post-Putin Russia, how do you ensure that the people you're negotiating with across the table are actually in it in good faith, especially given what we've learned, which is to say that it's not just Putin's war, right? This is a much broader, much more broadly supported war in the Russian Federation today.
First of all, with the support of the war, I think it's important to to realize what happened. This is my personal view now. I'm not speaking as a Swedish ambassador, but the foreign minister of today, Ahlin, back home in Sweden, and the state secretary for the prime minister, Stenström, and myself. We were traveling around a lot in the former Soviet Union states and in Russia. And we saw this change that happened in the Russian society. When Soviet Union broke down, they all wanted to be like Sweden and Germany. They wanted to have the welfare, they wanted to have a secure situation, they wanted to have the kids at universities, and they traveled, enormously to Europe and US and in UK and so on. And it was really good for a couple of years, right? But they also were a little bit ashamed of Yeltsin and others begging for help, asking for money, support from the West and so on. So there was a little bit of this kind of post-imperialistic stress syndrome, that we want to have our rightful place back in the world. And I was really concerned about it when I realized that even youngsters were talking like that. And I give you one example that I hate myself. People in Minsk, in Belarus, students in Minsk, until Poland became members of Europe, European Union and the Schengen, they could take a train from Minsk and go to Warsaw. It didn't cost anything, so little. And they just had to pay a little bit of a fee at the border. They had to change train because the width of the rails are different in Belarus than they are in Poland. I think it's 89 millimeters difference or something like that. But it was a kind of an opening, a freedom for students even, to go to Warsaw. And when they became members of Schengen, suddenly we put up a visa fee for students. And that visa fee was so expensive, so students in Belarus could no longer afford to go to Warsaw. And I was fighting hard back home in Swedish Parliament and with European counterparts that we should have a visa-free agreement with certain elements of the society, at least, if not with all Belarusians, at least with people up to 40 or students or something like that, because we need that. And we were never able to do it. And the Belarusian foreign minister, his name was Khostov at that time. And I told him, can't you be smart now and really say to Europe that we don't have any visa fee as a reciprocity, And he said, no way, we're going to do it. If they do it on us, we need to do it on them. So it also affected people from the eastern part of Poland to go to Minsk. What happened? My friends, and I'm talking about my friends now in Belarus. I was in Belarus so many times during, the beginning of the 90s and until that. They started to go to Moscow instead. You just put yourself in the car, drive, 1,000 kilometers north, and you're soon in Moscow. And Moscow grew. There was happy, fun, discotheques, lots of stores, neon lights, and so on. So they went there instead. So sometimes when people said that Belarus leader Lukashenko was locking in his people into Belarus, I always said that we also need to be careful that not we are locking them out from the European Union. So that's for me is a good lesson to learn that I think we made a wrong decision. We should have made it easier for people from these countries to go to Vilnius, to Warsaw, to Sweden, and so on, and continue doing that and showing, that this is how we live. This is also possible in Russia, and so on. But actually, we moving there. So even liberals and Democrats in Russia, we're looking more into the state capitalistic countries like China, Vietnam, and others. And we lost them there, unfortunately. So Putin came into power. He started to ride the nationalistic tiger. And the guy that really decided that was from the beginning, Gleb Pavlovsky. I'm sitting in his office. He's telling me all before it all happened that this is the idea to strengthen the narrative of Russia. We don't know what Russia means any longer. We need to bring that back. We need to show the people, what is Russia. So they started to ride the nationalistic tiger, and they were extremely successful. So Putin's party, Единая Россия, Единство, the name, they were really, successful. They were so successful, so even another guy, Rogozin, Dmitry Rogozin, started another party called Rodina that was even more nationalistic. So Putin had to destroy him and bring him in, and he was a NATO ambassador, and he's now Minister of Aerospace or something like that, into the tent, so to say. So when you start riding the nationalistic tiger, it's really dangerous and fast. And the people of Russia, they listened to it. They did. I mean, we shouldn't be naive here and think that lots of Russians are sitting there and say, oh yeah, we totally are against Putin. That's not really the truth. They feel that they have been left behind. They long back to something unclear what, but they want to be respected. They want to have the rightful place in the world, and so on. So there is a strong sentiment. And if Putin tomorrow is kicked out, I'm not sure that the new leader will be better than Putin. I'm not. I mean, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, I'm pretty sure it will be better. But now I'm not super sure that it will be a better leader actually there. So negotiating with him, here's my boring answer when it comes to coming into a peace negotiation. I think this conflict can only be solved among the Ukrainians and Russians. We don't want any new Minsk agreement where Germany and France go there and tell everyone else, that this is what you should sign up for and so on. I don't think that's doable. I think it's actually wrong. I really think the only way forward here is that Ukraine, Russia sits together and make an agreement. And I'm not in a position, no one else in the West are in position to tell the Ukrainians what they should give up or not give up. We are not in a position to tell the Russians. They need to work it out.
And on that note, I totally understand where you're coming from on that. And so does Zelensky.
Yeah.
He's certainly not appeared to in any way be somebody who is going to take someone else's marching orders to end it. So listen.
We had one more question. Can we take that one in the corner as well? I have time.
You have time? Okay.
Yeah.
If we can make it, we're running a little late, so go ahead.
Okay, I'm just wondering, when you're talking about democracy on
Yes.
the rock, you have the whiskey on the rock, I remember in 60, looking down south. What after the January the 6th and coming up November 8th? What do the Swedish people think about, this supposed entrenched democracy, okay? Right now, the vision is really rift in the United States. The second thing is, when we talk about Flashpoint, okay, there is another person is rising the tiger of nationalism, and that's in China.
Yeah.
And there will be people thinking, Ukraine, and they're also talking about what would happen in the South China Sea in Taiwan. There's probably another flashpoint. And the US think China is the greater peer rival than Russia. I just wonder what do the Swedish people think about these two problems, these two trouble spots? Thank you.
Okay, you might squeeze two questions into one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's see if we can squeeze two answers into one.
I think I would frame it like this. I mean, this is not a government position of Swedish, but it will be my own position as well, my own guess. I am actually a globalist. Okay. I really think it's good that we are on a global market and we are dealing with each other and we have opened up the markets. It has lifted lots of hundreds of millions of people from poverty. And we have pushed that agenda pretty hard from a kind of a Western view. And I'm not shying away from that. I think it has been pretty good. What we have been bad at is to make this globalization work for all. Internally in our own countries, in Sweden, in Canada, in the United States and so on. So lots of people see that we are getting richer and richer. There is a global, economic growth, but they don't feel that they have a say at the table. And traditional social democrat would say that we should distribute the wealth a little bit better, okay? And a social democrat of my kind would say that we should be better in giving people the instrument to pick the fruits from the globalization. And we haven't been good enough for that. So there is lots of people in our societies, even in Sweden, that feel that they are left behind. And I think we need to understand that. There are countries left behind, there are regions left behind, there are people being left behind. And they act, voting for more of a nationalistic idea, and they say, enough of this. I'm sick and tired of all this I hear from the big towns like Washington D.C. or what in Stockholm. I wanted to do it my own way back home where I live, and you have such a strong push all over the world. It's not only Xi Jinping. You have it in Erdogan in Turkey. You have it in Viktor Orban in Hungary. You have it in the Polish leadership. You have Bolsonaro in Brazil. You have it of Trump and others. And even the Democrats sometimes, is buy American first and stuff like that. So that message is so easy to tell people. And, I thought with COVID in the beginning that, wow, this is a wonderful opportunity to show the world that we need to have open borders. We need to work together and fix this. And maybe that's the lesson now, but you remember how it was in the beginning where countries were fighting each other. And even Germany, when we bought personal protective equipment being sent to Sweden, even Germany for a couple of days stopped it in Germany and said, we're not really sure we're going to send it to Sweden. Maybe we need it. And it was Germany and Sweden together, come on. So we cannot just say, and I'm here, I'm super personal now. I don't think it is the right way to just say that certain people are deplorables. They are rednecks. They don't understand what the heck is going on in the world and so on. That will only feed polarization. Democrats in the world, liberals, or from my own kind of more left-leaning way, we need to be better in finding way to give people an opportunity to pick the fruit of the globalization. And in the long run, it is not sustainable to have an elite in every society, the 1%ers that have an enormous power, enormous economic growth, and ordinary people feel that they are squeezed. So I think that is the reason why we have this polarization. It's so easy to feed in conspiracy theories and racism and discrimination into this kind of thing. So we need to rethink. We cannot just sit up here in Canada or in Sweden and look at the Americans and say, oh, they are so bloody stupid. They're going to vote for Trump again. Oh, what a crazy country. It's going to come closer to you in the future as well. That's I'm pretty sure about, so we should start thinking about it, what to do.
Okay.
Sorry for being a little bit political there, but I needed it.
We're gonna that's the old politician.
Yes,
right?
yeah, exactly.
We're gonna leave it at that. We've gone a bit over time, and I know that some of you've got other things you've got to get to, but we really appreciate your questions. We obviously appreciate the ambassador's answers. And his openness in talking about a wide range of issues. It really has been terrific. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Peter.